page. Hello and welcome to the stream. Parson reads the Book of Samuel. I'm just adjusting my microphone there. I think I should be a little bit clearer. And today we are reading from the Book of Samuel, 2 Samuel precisely. And we'll basically do a study / read from chapters 9 to chapter 12. I think I might need to, depending on if certain contexts are needed, I don't think I need to read more than that. I think chapters 9 to chapter 12 is a very interesting little story arc. And then, of course, next week is going to be, some Jerry Springer level of stuff. So, we're into some really interesting reads for the Bible in the next coming weeks. But, I don't know why I opened up with that. But, basically, that's where we are. Today, we're going to start with chapter 9. If you wish to follow along, and I encourage that you do, whip up, the beauties of modern age technology. The Bible is essentially free to anyone, right? Because, using a desktop, BibleGateway.com, and then, of course, just download the Bible app on your phone. They're free. No reason not to use them. And I mean, that's the bulk, honestly, that's the bulk how I read my Bible anyway. So, I mean, I encourage you to do the same. So, but anyway, I'll be using the New International Version, which you can just whip up on Bible Gateway or the Bible app, or NIV for short. And before we actually start reading, I'm going to start us off with a quick word of prayer. So let's just bow our heads for a moment. Lord God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this time that we have to read your word, and I pray that as we read your word, you would reveal truth to us and how important it is of how we live before you, and ultimately that our lives are oriented toward your will. And I just pray that, this reading into 2 Samuel would be insightful for us in that regard. I pray this in the name of your son, Jesus. Amen. All right, so my preface of before we start chapter 9. So basically, last week we read about how basically David had officially, I guess you could say, became king of Israel. So for a while he was like king of Judah, one of the tribes, and technically what later becomes the southern part of Israel, Judah. But I mean, this is before that, right? Because the split happens basically after Solomon's reign, because King Solomon, who comes after David, basically somehow actually maintained the unity of Israel and Judah. But he's a little later, so we don't need to worry about that too much right now. But basically, before that, when we're in David's time as king, he attempts to unify the two. He attempts to unify Judah and Israel. And of course, there's some conflict with that because, of course, some of the people in Israel were still loyal to the family of Saul. And so there was some civil war. Whereas the people of Judah were more loyal to David, right? And that's where the civil war came in, and there was a fair amount of fighting, even though, you know, David, wanted to try to avoid it. He wanted to be respectful to, like, Saul's family, but at the same time, David was like, well, God kind of put me in charge, so you guys should kind of concede, which is eventually what happens. The last few members of Saul's family are like, all right, we're tired of getting assassinated, so yeah, you can rule Israel, because like half of Saul's family basically is like assassinated at various points, and it's kind of ridiculous. But basically, they concede, and then David becomes a king of a unified Israel and Judah. And so that's basically what happens. And then, of course, there's a few other like details about how like God talks to David after a while, and he's like, now that you're the king of Israel, blah 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 blah. I'm gonna do great things in your life. I'm gonna make you prosperous and all that stuff. And God promising David awesome stuff. Nothing out of the ordinary there. And then, of course, we just hear a little bit of David's exploits. He goes beats up some Philistines and whatever, and that's chapter 8. And then basically now we're moving to chapter 9, which is in the midst of all this, like, David starting out being a king and beating up people like he normally does. So that's where we are in our Bible reading progression. And so now we're going to start with chapter 9. All right, 2 Samuel, chapter 9. Now David was asking, is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? Now there was a servant of Saul's house named Ziba, and they summoned him to appear before David. And the king said to him, are you Ziba? At your service, he replied. And the king asked, is there no one still alive in the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness? Ziba answered, there is still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet. Where is he? The king asked. And Ziba replied, he is at the house of Machir, son of Amil, in Lodebar. So King David had him brought from Lodebar, from the house of Machir, son of Amil. When oh God, how do you pronounce this? Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David. He bowed down to pay him homage. And David said, Mephibosheth? At your service, he replied. Don't be afraid, David said to him, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table. Mephibosheth bowed down and said, what is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me? Then the king summoned Ziba, Saul's steward, and said to him, I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. So basically, he had the manpower to run the farm. Then Ziba said to the king, your servant will do whatever my lord the king commands his servant to do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. Now Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah, and all the members of Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table. He was lame in both feet. So chapter 9 is pretty short. Now, basically, the TLDR of chapter 9 is that David is holding a promise, fulfilling a promise, if you will, to his friend Jonathan, who's long since dead at this point, right? Because Jonathan was killed back in, like, 1 Samuel 31, right? Or 30, whatever. The end of 1 Samuel. And so, yeah, 31. And Jonathan had been dead for a while, basically, right? And so, but David still, he held that honor to fulfill the promise that he had to Jonathan, that they made back in, somewhere in the early 20s of 1 Samuel, right? Go read my previous streams of which one it was up. So, or go watch my previous streams of when I was talking about that. So basically, David is fulfilling this promise. And this is interesting to observe. I'm going to just turn this down a bit. Oh, crap. Sorry, hang on. I have all this stuff over here, like my headset and stuff, and my headset just fell over, and I really hope I didn't damage it at all. Okay, now it's too dark. I gotta keep tinkering with this thing a bit, and I can never get it perfect. There you go. But anyway, so what's interesting about David fulfilling his promise to Jonathan, even after all this time, and even after Jonathan's been dead for a while, it still shows the loyalty David has to, well, particularly Jonathan, but to Saul and his family, right? And how David holds Saul's to a very high esteem, right? Because technically David is under no obligation to do this, right? There's no reason for him to do this, but he does it because, he's a good guy and wants to show honor to Saul's family, and particularly to Jonathan. And so he provides and he takes care of Jonathan's son, right? And of course, the other thing too is that Jonathan's son is probably like the symbol of like the most screwed person you could possibly encounter. Right? He's basically like totally screwed in his life, right? Like orphan. He's got a disability, right? He's a person of no status, right? He's basically a nobody, and he's like the bottom of the bucket of society at this point, right? How the mighty have fallen, right? Going from the king's grandson to basically nobody. And so, this kind of is designed to paint David in a very positive light, and it does, right? That David is an honorable person. Yeah, he's got his flaws, obviously, as a person, but he's still an honorable person to an extent. And in regards to his love for Jonathan, it's reflected in his mercy toward Mephibosheth and basically restoring him. Like, when it says, like, the land that used to belong to Saul, it obviously doesn't mean, like, the kingdom. But, like, when Saul was, his family's land, right? Because, of course, think of it like this. Like, the illustration I'll use is, let's say President Biden, he's in the White House and he kind of lives there. But of course he obviously has his own house, right, that he also lives at. So let's say that there was some major turnover and he lost both, right? Like Saul did. I'm kind of paralleling Biden to Saul here. So let's say he lost both. President Biden lost both, right? Now, the next president comes along, whoever that might be, and then decides, I'm going to restore Biden's family, Biden's property. They obviously don't mean the White House because, of course, the new president would be the president, and the president is the one in the White House. But, of course, Biden had his own place to live in, right? And so that is what was restored to Mephibosheth, in a sense, right? The land of Kish, the land that used to belong to Kish, Saul's father, that Saul obviously came to own later on. And so that is what David means when he says, like, I'll restore the land that belonged to your father. So I know that could be a little bit confusing when you're reading that. And it's like, wait, if he's restoring to Mephibosheth everything that belonged to Saul, does that mean that Mephibosheth has the kingdom? That's not true. That's not how that works, right? But, of course, I think the implication, and once again, this is kind of speculation because the Bible doesn't explicitly tell you this, but in the turmoil of Saul going insane for starters, and then of course dying in a really shitty way, him and his sons all dying in the battle against the Philistines. You know, his home, not the kingdom, his home probably wasn't managed very well, and so it might have been given over to someone or, um, sold off or whatever, right? And what David's doing here is that he's basically reclaiming that and giving it to Mephibosheth. Now, what's interesting about this is obviously, many a pastor will say like the crystal typology, the Christological typology, where David is like a type of Christ here, is the quote unquote redemptive factor of reclaiming the land that was once Saul's and then putting it in its right place, right? Just like how in Christianity we talk about how, like, well, Jesus redeems our souls and puts it back in a right relationship with God, right? That kind of thing, right? And so David is kind of doing this, redemptive action with Saul's land and putting it back into the house of Saul through Mephibosheth. Of course, the funny thing is that Mephibosheth himself doesn't actually oversee the land at all because, one, he's disabled, so he couldn't anyway. And two, David is going to give Mephibosheth special privileges, right? That he gets to eat at his table. Of course, obviously, that David is just saying that he's going to get all these special privileges, and the Bible even states that, like, well, he ate at the table like one of David's sons, right? So basically, he's a prince, even though he's not a prince. But you get the idea, right? He gets to live as if he's royal. Mephibosheth gets to live like he's royalty, even though he's not. At least, not really, because of course Saul's family aren't the monarchy anymore. David's family is. And so that's basically the TLDR of chapter 9. It's pretty straightforward. But it does show this interesting side of David where he does kind of carry out his promise to Jonathan. And it's like, oh, it's a good mini story about how nice a guy David can be. And of course, another thing to also consider is, of course, David would act generously this way because we did read a couple chapters ago where God was basically telling David, yo, I'm going to do some great stuff in your life, right? I'm going to be super generous here. I'm going to make you prosperous and you're going to be victorious in all your battles and da-da-da-da-da, right? And God makes these promises to David. So with David knowing this, and yeah, there's the whole, like, his faith is obviously very powerful here. And of course, we should always acknowledge that's a very important part of anyone's life, is the faithfulness they show to trust in God. And David does trust in God here, and that's one of his virtues. So when David trusts in God here, he acts in kind to Mephibosheth. And so that is, you're supposed to look at chapter 7 and chapter 9 in that parallel, right? That, well, God promises these things to David, and God is being kind to him, if you will. But then now David is doing the same with Mephibosheth, right? And that's basically how chapter 9 goes down. There's really not much else to say about it, because it's a pretty straightforward sequence of events, right? I mean, yeah, it's just the parallel bit, but once again, that's still kind of straightforward. I don't think I have to talk about it too much. Alrighty. Chapter 10. Moving on. Now, in the course of time, the king of the Ammonites died, and his son Hanun succeeded him as king. And David thought, I will show kindness to Hanun, the son of Nahash, just as his father showed kindness to me. So David sent a delegation to express his sympathy to Hanun concerning his father. Now when David's men came to the land of the Ammonites' commander said to Hanun their lord, Do you think David is honoring your father by sending envoys to you to express sympathy? Hasn't David sent them to you only to explore the city and spy it out and overthrow it? So Hanun seized David's envoys, shaved off half of each man's beard, cut off their garments at the buttocks, and sent them away. When David was told about this, he sent messengers to meet the men, for they were greatly humiliated. And the king said, Stay at Jericho till your beards have grown, and then come back. When the Ammonites realized that they had been obnoxious to David, they hired 20,000 Aramean foot soldiers from Beth Rehob to Zobah, as well as the king of Makkah with 1,000 men, and also 12,000 men from Tob. Well, that went from 0 to 60 real fast. On hearing this, David sent Joab out of the entire army of fighting men. The Ammonites came out and drew up in battle formation at the entrance of their city gate, while the Arameans of Zorah and Rehob and the men of Tob and Makkah were by themselves in the open country. Joab saw that there were battle lines in front of them and behind him, so he selected some of the best troops in Israel and deployed them against the Arameans. He put the rest of the men under the command of Abishai, his brother, and deployed them against the Ammonites. Now Joab said, If the Arameans are too strong for me, then you are to come to my rescue. But if the Ammonites are too strong for you, I will come to rescue you. Be strong and let us fight bravely for our people and the cities of our God. The Lord will do what is good in his sight. Then Joab and the troops with him advanced to fight the Arameans, and they fled before him. When the Ammonites realized that the Arameans were fleeing, they fled before Abishai and went inside the city. So Joab returned from fighting the Ammonites and came to Jerusalem. After the Arameans saw that they had been routed by Israel, they regrouped. Hadadezer had Arameans brought from beyond the Euphrates, and they went to Halam, with Shobach, the commander of Hadadezer's army, leading them. And when David was told of this, he gathered all Israel, crossed the Jordan, and went to Halam. The Arameans formed their battle lines to meet David and fought him, but they fled before Israel, and David killed 700 of their charioteers and 40,000 of their foot soldiers. He also struck down Shobach, the commander of their army, and he died there. When all the kings who were vassals of Hadadezer saw that they had been routed by Israel, they made peace with the Israelites and became subject to them. So the Arameans were afraid to help the Ammonites anymore. This is going to be a short stream at this rate because we're already done chapter 10. So chapter 10, once again, is another kind of short war story. You know, David kicking ass. What else is new? And so this time, it's kind of like funny how the story goes about, right? So first we have the David's like to the Ammonites, hey guys, like, I want to be nice to you. How can I help? What can I do for you, right? I want to just do something. I just feel like being a nice guy. Let me do something for you, right? With the Ammonites, I don't know what these guys were thinking. I guess they were, you know, overly suspicious, right? And unnecessarily so. Where they were like, oh no, like, David's here to spy out the land. let's just send these guys, let's kick these guys out of here because we don't want anything to do with this David guy, right? Of course, as the old saying goes, one often meets their fate on the road they use to avoid it, right? And so these guys wanting to avoid an ass whooping end up taking the path that leads them to an ass whooping. So, real smart move there, guys, right? So, one of the weird things in this story is how they humiliate the guys, right? The David's envoys. Now the second part's kind of obvious, right? Where they rip off like the back part of their pants, basically, and your ass is like bare. Like that. That's pretty embarrassing, right? Like nobody wants to walk around town with pants that have no backside, right? With your butt exposed. That part's kind of obvious. But of course, it's that weird thing with like shaving half their beards, and it's like, okay, like how is this like an issue, right? Well, like you just got a free haircut, I guess. But in the ancient world, people showed their maturity through how much facial hair they had, right? And of course, shaving wasn't done the same way as we do, and of course, beauty standards aren't the same as they are now, right? Well, I mean, maybe they are. Maybe things are not that different from how they were back then. But you know, it's not like, let's put it this way: for the Israelites back then, having a beard was like a symbol of masculinity, right? You're a hardcore dude if you were growing out your beard, and we still do that with some today to an extent, right? Like, yeah, manly men that don't shave, right? Manly men with their wicked ass beards. And then of course there's those guys like me who doesn't grow facial hair very well, and I shave every few days. So, uh, you know, guys are different, right? But basically, when a guy has his like pride and like that wicked beard he's been growing, and then someone just like when it shaves it in half, it's probably like you just grab the bottom of it and just like knife here to like cut the lower part, and then you get this weird boxy beard. Um, think of it as like the inverse, if you will, of like, you ever heard of, everyone knows what the bowl cut is, right? The bowl cut is when basically it's how you cut someone's hair. You put a bowl on top and you shave it off, and you take off the bowl, and that's the person's hair, right? The bowl cut. And it's one of those things that we make fun of, like kids who have the bowl cut. When I was a kid, and everyone made jokes about the bowl cut. I didn't have a bowl cut, thank God. Um, my grandfather used to cut my hair, and at least he did not do that with me. So, thank God for that, right? But like, the bowl cut, and everyone makes jokes of the bowl cut and how ugly it looks and whatever, right? Or how goofy and silly it looks, right? And so, shaving when they shave a guy's beard in half was basically the equivalent of the bowl cut with a guy's like beard and his mustache, right? It's just one of those things that's like a ha ha kind of thing when someone has a bowl cut. It's the same kind of thing when like you have a half shaven beard. It just looks awkward and probably looks terrible. I would love to see like a what would be the equivalent of like a bowl cut for your beard, because you can't really, that doesn't really work, right? You can't put a bowl and then shave. But like, hmm, I wonder, maybe I'd take like some guy with like a big beard, put a bowl over his mouth, and like shave all the other hair outside of it, and give it the bowl beard. Maybe I'll make that a thing one day with somebody. The ultimate form of torture, right there. But it is one of those weird things where, like, when we read it as modern readers, it's like a bizarre idea of like, oh, you know, half shaving a guy's beard is like humiliating. I mean, I guess it is. But I mean, wouldn't the ripping the back part of the pants, have your butt exposed, be enough? But then I suppose you can change your pants pretty quickly if you get out of town fast. But and then of course, David's like, all right, you have waged war by embarrassing me, is what David basically does, right? But of course, the the Ammonites, they kind of crank it up to the extreme. They're like, okay, not only have we raised David's ire, we're gonna tell them that this is war, right? And so they get like this huge army, and you read it's like what, like several hundred, like well not hundred, like tens of thousands of guys, right? It's a couple 10,000 guys, and that's when it's like, oh, like, are you for real? Like, it went from 0 to 60 real fast there. And what does it say? Like, it says like, one guy was like with 1,000 men, and then there were like 12,000 guys in this other place. Like, that's a lot of guys, right? Like, what started out as like, oh, a simple decline. What could have just been resolved as like a simple decline of like, oh, we don't want your help. Go away. To like this all-out war with like thousands of people, right? It's just like, was this necessary? Was this necessary? This is one of those moments. Because, I mean, to be fair, that's how a lot of wars actually are, unfortunately, in history. It's usually like, it starts out as something trivial, like, oh, yeah, we don't want anything to do with you, go away. And then, like, instead of just saying, like, oh, we don't trust you, it goes to, like, now we're going to humiliate you, and then we're going to raise your ire so that we can fight. Just because we're bored, I guess. Like, just throwing away people's lives just because other people are bored. I mean, real talk though, that's why war is such an ugly thing in general, right? It's because usually like things can be resolved a lot more peacefully, and if people just actually talk to each other and not do stupid things like this, then you would save like three quarters of the world's problems, right? Because then people wouldn't be having wars over stupid crap like this, right? And so, oops, sorry. People wouldn't have wars over stupid crap like this, and then like you would spare so many people's lives. It would be great it would really help out the economy if people didn't have to spend it on stupid fights, stuff like that, right? It would save a lot of problems, right? But of course, as I've made the reference earlier, it's like, you often meet your destiny on the road you take to avoid it. And so earlier, God had always kind of planned that he was going to like, all right, I'm done with you Ammonites. If you're going to keep disobeying me, you're not going to, repent of your sin. You're going to die one day, right? Basically what God tells the Ammonites. He's basically like, if you're going to keep disobeying me, you're going to die one day. And then here, David tries to bring a peace offering, and then, of course, these guys are like, no, we're going to fight you, which is how you're way more likely to die if you pick a fight with somebody. Let's just say that, right? So, and that's exactly what happens to these guys, right? They just get annihilated because David's like, yeah, you should have just taken my peace offering because now I'm going to whoop your ass, and that's exactly what David does, right? He annihilates them pretty handily. And you just gotta like shake your head for the Ammonites. You're just like, all of this could have been avoided, man. All of this could have been avoided. Why do people do that, right? But goes to show, right? That people like to do things the hard way. Then we get to, well, actually before that, I just want to talk a little bit about how chapter 10 has one of these little entries of like, we're going to talk about some of David's guys, his officials, if you will. And Joab is back in the picture, right? Joab is like one of David's generals, and he's also like one of his chief advisors. I guess he would be like the Will Stutely to Robin Hood, right? To David's Robin Hood. And so Joab is like, all right, I'm going to lead this attack. And then him and his brother, basically, like, there's a story about how, like, they split up their forces, Joab and his brother, and then when they managed to fight both fronts of like the Ammonites and then their allies, the Armenians and those guys, right? And so they split up their forces, and then they handily defeat them, right? Because they're just that awesome, I guess, right? And so Joab and his brother Abishai, they win a bunch of battles for David before David comes in and does the killing blow, right? And it's just one of those little exploits of like, David's men, right? Because we don't get to see too many of these. We get little episodes here and there. I guess so like if you think of like from the writer's perspective, it's like here's a badass moment in the life of David, which has nothing to do with David, but it's awesome, and I'm going to tell you about it anyway. It's kind of how these stories are, right? And I they're things to be appreciated. I at least appreciate them because once again, there's the whole like historical aspect that the Bible has, obviously with the Book of Samuel, but at the same time, it maintains the more bard-like narrative and the oral storytelling tradition when it has these breakaways from the historical narrative and says, "Hey, let me just tell you this badass moment that happened." And when you're telling a story, right? That's always fun and appreciated. It's why like in any given like long lecture of any kind, including my own streams, I do this too. Every orator does this, where it's a certain skill you have to develop, right? It's where you have to kind of do a side story away from the main thing you're talking about, just to get a laugh and to make things interesting, so that they don't have to hear your monotonic talking about the same thing over, you know, the entire course of however long you're talking, right? Like, and you notice this in my past streams, right? I'll tell these weird little stories throughout the stream because, like, imagine if I only talked about one thing for the like whole 2 hours, right? Like, it's gonna get you're gonna fall asleep at some point, right? You think of like, the jokes about people falling asleep in church during like a 30-minute sermon, right? And 30 minutes isn't even that long, right? Like, the stream's already been going for like 40 minutes, so people fall asleep in church for 30-minute sermons, right? But of course, any good orator knows how to like make a break in that like time period so that it gets everybody's attention. You bring people back in if people are falling asleep, kind of thing, right? But that's kind of what these little stories kind of serve their purpose. And we have one of those stories, right? And I guess Joab is kind of like one of the main guys of David, right? Because he shows up a couple of times, right? And he's always out there helping David kick some ass, right? So he's fun to read, I guess, right? And he's fun to hear about. And so I guess the Bible included this little short story about him. One, it's relevant because it's during the event of the fight between David and the Ammonites. And of course, it's interesting that like, oh, it's not just David who's doing everything, right? He's got these elite fighters that can also go around and do work, right? And make short work of, the Ammonites and their allies. So we get to the end of chapter 10, and basically what happens is that David's like, all right, I'm done with you guys. If you're going to do it this way, I'm going to just, destroy you, basically. And sure, there's like a remnant of Ammonites left or whatever, but they're basically done, right? They don't have anything left. And David's like, yeah, you guys are done. Now the rest of you survivors are basically going to be my footstool. You're my slaves now. Deal with it. And then the Arameans all run away. They're like, yeah, we're not doing this. So David's just showing his powers, right? And his prowess as a king. And that it would be foolish to challenge him. Now for something totally different. And this story is an interesting one. I'm going to spend the rest of the stream with the next two chapters, which is really one story. And it's, one of the big ones. It's a somewhat popular one. As in, like, most Christians know the story. Maybe not told, even though it's not one often used in Sunday school. It is one that is often well known. And chapter 11 begins with the story of David and Bathsheba. Chapter 11. Now in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, I guess it was a tradition, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. Now one evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. Now from the roof he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. And the man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messengers to get her. So she came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanliness. When she went back home, the woman conceived and sent word to David saying, "I am pregnant." Jerry Springer moments. It's kind of like just the bomb drop, huh? Just like that. Just like, "I'm pregnant." Good job, David. So David sent this word to Joab. "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent him to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked him how he was, and how Joab was, how the soldiers were, and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. But Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants, and did not go down to his house. David was told Uriah did not go home. So he asked Uriah, Haven't you just come from a military campaign? Why don't you go home?" Uriah said to David, "The ark of Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat, drink, and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." Then David said to him, "Stay here one more day, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. At David's invitation, he ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. But in the evening, Uriah went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants. He did not go home. Now in the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it he wrote, "Put Uriah out in the front where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die." So while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. When the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men of David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. So Joab sent David a full account of the battle. He instructed the messenger, "When you have finished giving the king this account of the battle, the king's anger may flare up, and he may ask you, 'Why did you get so close to the city to fight? Why did you know they would shoot arrows from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, son of Jerubesheth? Didn't a woman drop an upper millstone on him from the wall, so that he died in Thebes? why did you get so close to the wall? If he asks you this, say to him, moreover, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead. The messenger set out, and when he arrived, he told David everything Joab had sent him to say. The messenger said to David, the men overpowered us and came out against us in the open, but we drove them back to the entrance of the gate. Then the archers shot arrows at your servants from the wall, and some of the king's men died. Moreover, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead. David told the messenger, say this to Joab. Don't let this upset you. Don't let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as another. Press the attack against the city and destroy it. Say this to encourage Joab. When Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. After the time of mourning was over, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. So chapter 11 is a doozy. Just checking something here. Okay, so chapter 11 is a doozy, right? And it's a pretty well-known story. I mean, VeggieTales actually tackled this story and did it in a very interesting way, right? Because it's VeggieTales, right? And so it's a story that would be pretty well known. I mean, some Sunday schools would play the VeggieTales version of this story, right? Of course, in the VeggieTales version, it's like Larry and his rubber ducks, right? And he had to have someone else's rubber duck, and of course sure, it's, you know, the kid-friendly version, but I mean the metaphor works because we'll see basically that metaphor is used, and I think VeggieTales obviously used it for that reason. But with chapter 11, so it starts out with David doing something that he shouldn't be doing. So it's funny where like the Bible kind of tells it this way. It's like, it was spring where kings go to war. I'm like, what, is that just a thing kings do? It's just like, hey, it's springtime, let's go kick somebody's ass, right? Like, I guess it's what people do because they're bored, right? In the ancient world. I don't know. I mean, yeah, what else do people do back then, right? It's like, I guess we're bored, we're gonna go fight people, right? And I love how the Bible just words it like, in the spring where kings go to war. It's like, that's what people do as a pastime. Throwing away people's lives, which I guess is another reason why the ancient world kind of really sucks, right? It's terrible, actually. Ancient world sucks because of that. Like, just think about that. Like, imagine if you lived in a time and you're like, it's hard to build a life because, oh, springtime's coming, you might get conscripted to fight for someone else, and you might not make it out alive, right? Like, that prospect sounds pretty terrible, but I guess is what people do, right? It's springtime and kings go to war. But here's David, just like chilling out in his palace, right? Just kind of not at work, right? He's not doing what kings do, right? Which is interesting because on the one hand, it's like, okay, David is not showing his bloodthirsty side, right? Because, you know, as I've pointed out in other parts of 2 Samuel and 1 Samuel as well, you know, David has this like bloodlusty tendency. It's like if there's a chance to fight, David's gonna do it, right? But here he's not doing it. So what's up with that, right? Now on the one hand, you might think, well, that's a good thing, right? David's not going around just killing people, right? But on the other hand, it's like, this is suspicious because you know, how's it go? The devil you know is the devil you know is not as bad as the devil you don't, right? And so we don't know. Well, when the story starts out, you don't know what kind of machination's going to go on with David, right? You don't know what's going to happen. And so it really brings this kind of suspense to the story immediately, which I think is actually kind of clever in the writing. That, like, David isn't doing what he normally does. So that means today is going to be a weird day. It's going to be out there, right? Because David isn't doing what he normally does, even though what he normally does is a little bit disturbing at times. You know, being bloodlusty and all that. But when he's going around being a little bloodlusty, you know what's up. You know David is just doing David things, right? But here, it's a little suspect, right? Because David isn't doing that. He's not doing what we expect him to do. And so something's up, right? And it catches you as the audience, pretty quickly. Something's up. Then we get to David, he goes out to his palace, the roof of his palace, and then he looks around, and I guess people had, well, outdoor bathing was not an uncommon thing. You think of, like, in the ancient world, by the time the Romans came around, it was definitely a much more known thing where, like, there was public baths and it was generally pretty open. So the idea of public bathing, or bathing in the open wasn't, like, a weird concept, because of course, like, people would bathe in public anyway, right? That's public baths was a thing in the ancient world. But I mean, then again, the contrast is that, for us as moderns, in the 21st century, we're so used to things like private toiletry, right? To have your own bathroom, right? That is a very modern invention, and it's a very modern luxury, right? Ancient world wasn't like that. And so for this bathing thing to occur in, like, a place that someone else could just look over, right, was very possible. But of course, that leads to, under most circumstances, it'd be like, okay, people bathe in public. But then, of course, this is David we're talking about. And David has another problem that isn't his, bloodthirstiness. And that's his, womanizing problems. So, guy known for womanizing, open baths. You gotta see where this is going, right? So, he catches a sight of this woman, and she's, attractive. And David's just like, who dat, right? And then, someone, like, he gets someone to, check, to find out who this woman is, and tells him, well, this is Bathsheba. She's the daughter of so-and-so and the wife of, one of your servants. Now, here's the interesting thing. The Bible does this as a throwaway statement, but there's a lot going on here. And it really shows you how depraved David can be, right? We just read that David was actually supposedly not that bad a guy, when he was being nice to Mephibosheth and all that. But then we get to hear, and David's a really depraved human being. But to be fair, it's meant to talk. This story is a reminder that all of us as human beings are like this to an extent, right? Maybe not to David's extremes, but we all have this capacity, if you will, of, like, we can be pretty good on one day, and then we can be the worst of human beings on other days, right? And David takes this to the extreme, right? So the throwaway line is that after David learns about who she is, he invites her over, and then they have sex. Now hold on here, a lot is actually happening here, because one, David knows who this is, right? He just asks, like, an advisor to find out who this is. And then he goes with it anyway. He goes along with this plan. He thinks up of, like, well, he saw her bathing, and he was, his lust drives were cranked up, and even though he learned who she was, he didn't care about that. He was thinking with the wrong head, right? So that, this really shows the kind of person David is, right? And I mean, we already know that he's not always the most logical human being, right? He tends to think with his other head more often than not, right? And this is one of those moments where that really, this occurs, and but it really showed like this line that's kind of treated like a throwaway line that David just invites her over and then he has sex with her. You know, there's so much depravity in David's person to go over, right? And as I've said earlier, David knows who this is, and he does what he's going. He still thinks about doing it. He still thinks about bringing her over to his place and having sex with her. He's still thinking about it, even though he knows that he shouldn't. At least he should know that he shouldn't, right? He knows that this is someone else's wife, and not just anyone else's wife. Like one of his you know, commanding officers or someone that he knows pretty well. It's implied that Uriah may have been one of David's his original 400 guys when David was running away from Saul. Uriah may have been one of these original guys. The other thing too is that it's apparent that Uriah might have been a foreigner. After all, it points out he's a Hittite, so he's a foreigner, which does bring up something else that's kind of interesting later, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But David this woman Bathsheba, which of course there's I don't know if the wordplay works in Hebrew. I probably have to research this more. I don't know if the wordplay exists in Hebrew, but of course in English it's kind of ironic that he sees a girl bathing and her name happens to be Bathsheba. That's gotta be one of the greatest wordplays if I've ever seen one. But that's besides the point. So David knows who this is, and he carries out his plan anyway, right? And then this is on top of all the other sins that he's doing, right? He's committing adultery because remember, he himself is married to a whole bunch of women. Of course, I mean you could argue that David's always committing adultery because he's polygamous, right? And picking up other people's wives, right? Which kind of if you really think about it, makes him really scumbaggy, right? He's not just a womanizer. I mean, the fact that he's a womanizer is a big enough problem as it is. But it's not just a guy meeting a bunch of single girls in a nightclub, right? Which we already call those guys major scumbags. But this guy is straight up picking up other people's wives. That is beyond scumbaggy. I don't even, if you have a word for that, please. Let's make up a word of what is the next level beyond being a total scumbag, right? Because that's what David is being here, right? He is beyond a scumbag at this point, right? So he's picking up basically his friend's wife, right? Then he has sex with her. Then, this of course there's another thing too that kind of makes you wonder, why didn't you could say that on the one hand, you could ask, why didn't Bathsheba reject David's advances? But of course, he's the king, so you can't really. It'd be tough to say no to the king because he can have you executed. But of course, this then goes back on David being absolutely horrible, right? Because he's abusing his power as king, right? Basically, no woman can refuse him because he's king. You can be killed for saying no to the king, right? And so maybe that's one reason why Bathsheba goes along with it. Even though this is probably from Bathsheba's perspective, this is a terrible idea. Why is she meeting up with definitely the having sex with the king part has got to be a major no-no. That she should have known this. I'm sure she did, but of course the easier explanation is just say that she probably couldn't have said no. And I'm gonna give Bathsheba the benefit of the doubt, right? That she did not choose to. She wasn't willing to sleep with King David. Of course, this just makes David even worse, right? Because then we go into other territory that I don't want to talk about, but you know what I mean. You know what I mean, right? Once again, if there's a word for beyond scumbaggy, please, let's either find that word or make up a new word for it. Because that's what David is being right now. So he has sex with someone else's wife. Even it could be without her consent even. But, I mean, what's she going to do, right? And of course, in in a way, David is violating all kinds of laws of God, right? I mean, if you think about it, he's been doing this for a while now. But, you know, then to make things worse, she gets pregnant, right? Because the Bible does say that, well, she just finished her menstrual period, which is what the Bible was talking about when it said, like, oh, her uncleanliness time is the way they described a woman's menstrual cycle, right? So she just finished this, which means that, her ovaries are ready to go again, basically, right? That's what that means. And so, of course, she gets pregnant, right? So that just makes this is just getting worse, right? And so first David tries to come up with this plan, right? Well, I'm gonna come up with this great plan to get myself out of trouble here because I just got someone else's wife pregnant because he can't keep his plunger in his pants. So David then comes up with this plan, right? And I love how David tries to get this plan to go down, right? He's just like, okay, send Uriah home. And he's talking to Uriah, he's like, hey man, like what's up? Like how you been? So Uriah, now that you're home, why don't you get some R&R, go home, have a nice bath. Have a nice bath, you know what I mean? Right? And Uriah's like, yeah, whatever, right? Like, sure, go home. But then, of course, Uriah's like, no, I can't do that. It's not right if I were to go home and, lay in my nice bed and make love to my wife kind of thing. I can't do that while all my buddies are like risking, risking their lives, right? And fighting this war for you. I can't go home and have pleasures, right? And Uriah even flat out says it, like, I can't go home, get drunk, and have sex, right? Not so, like, he obviously knew the euphemism. David's just like, yeah, go home and have a good time, right? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But Uriah doesn't do it, which only complicates things. But then again, if you really thought about it, and the Bible does this weird thing. Now you gotta take this with a grain of salt, because I know some people might want to throw out certain words in regard to when the Bible does this. But the fact of the matter is, it's not just the Bible that does it. So like, you can't blame the Bible only for doing this. But when it's pointing out that someone is from a different place, it's definitely implying race here and that they are of a different ethnicity, right? So when it says Uriah the Hittite, he's clearly not Jewish. That's basically what it's getting at. He's not a Hebrew, right? And which then brings suspect to David's plan. So I'm like, hold up a second. So Uriah he's a foreigner, which means he's not Hebrew, which means he might not look Hebrew. If this kid is born and looks like a Hebrew, I mean, maybe Bathsheba can be very well Hebrew. But you would expect that if Uriah had a kid with Bathsheba, it would be a mixed kid. It would look different from other kids. Right? Well, did David think this part through very well? Because, maybe with all David's military knowledge, he might know very little about biology, for all we know. But, did David think this part through? I don't know if he thought this part through. Because the Bible is clearly implying that this wasn't going to work. Because even if Uriah had sex with Bathsheba, and then Bathsheba were to claim that this kid was Uriah's kid, but then of course the kid would be born, grow up a little bit, and not look like Uriah. It's kind of like, this is such a terrible example, but like, King of the Hill has a good example of this, right? Dale's son. Trying to remember his name. I'm gonna look it up. Right now. Just give me a second. King of the Hill. What's his name? It starts with like an R or something like that. King of the Hill. Characters, I guess. I need a list of the characters. Alright, so. Okay, the main character, Dale. Okay. What's his son's name? Okay, it's not Robert, because that's Bill Dotree. Um, trying to find. Just give me a moment. I'm gonna find the name of. Um, okay, hang on. Okay, so Dale is Gribble. Okay, what's Dale's son's name? I'm trying to find Dale's son's name. Joseph. Yeah, Joseph. So, yeah, I gotta get an image of this now too. So, because we're here. Um, images. Let's just find. They have a good picture of like Joseph Gribble. So basically, the thing I'm referring to is that like in King of the Hill, Dale, one of Hank is the main character, and one of his friends, Dale, he's married to this one woman. Can't remember her name. I should have looked it up while I was looking up his son's name. And basically, um, Dale's wife has been having an affair for years, for years, with a guy named John Redcorn. And John Redcorn is an indigenous person. So obviously, he looks very different. He's not white, right? Because in King of the Hill, Dale's a white guy. His wife is a white woman, and then their son though is clearly very dark. He's very dark skinned because he's actually half indigenous. It's because Joseph is not Dale's son. He's actually John Redcorn's son, and Dale's wife's been having a relationship with him for years. Of course, the thing is that like the show kind of does this thing where like Dale is completely oblivious to it, right? Dale is completely oblivious to it, while everyone else basically knows, right? But of course, the other problem is that like none of them have the heart to tell him that your wife's been cheating on you for like years, ever since your marriage even began, maybe even before you got married, right? And so the funny thing is that like you look at Joseph, and Joseph looks nothing like Dale, but of course Dale's like, no, I'm his father, right? Of course, it's kind of like on the one hand, Dale's like a total cuck, but on the other hand, he's like a good dad because he's raising he's raising a kid that's not his own and raises him as if he were his father, and so I guess he's a good father in that sense. Of course, Dale's also an idiot, so that can be suspect. But the idea that I'm getting at here is that like, look, this kid looks nothing like you. How are you not even remotely suspicious that like this kid is not your kid, right? And so, you know, going back with David's plan of having Uriah have sex with Bathsheba so that she could pass off David's kid as Uriah's kid, I don't think this plan would have worked very well. The Bible implies this plan would not have worked very well, because if Uriah is a Hittite, he obviously looks different from everyone else, and then you're gonna have like, Joseph Gribble, you know, kind of looking kid among a bunch of Hebrews, and it's like it's gonna bring up questions, right? Or rather, the opposite would be true, right? Because you would expect a Joseph Gribble, but then of course, like, no, the kid is like a real Hebrew, like a full Hebrew. Um, Unless, of course, the implication is that, I mean, either way you cut it, right? Like, the fact that David and Uriah are two different ethnicities, the kid is going to look like, is going to have a dead giveaway that he's, David's kid more than he's Uriah's, right? And so, once again, David's plan just not working. But then, of course, we get to this chapter's 0 to 60, and David comes up with this plan. He's like, well, guess I gotta just kill the guy. Which makes you go, what? Right? Because that's, David, he first tries to trick Uriah. Now he's just gonna have the guy killed. And of course, once again, there's all this other kind of like shifty things going on here, and it's one of those things of like how totalitarian kings can be, at least human kings, and how totalitarian they can be, is that no one questions David. No one challenges him, because no one really can challenge him, right? He's the king of Israel. And of course, the way that, one of the things that, this is more implied rather than outright stated, but perhaps because of the way David treated Saul as king, like the Lord's anointed, you can't touch this. Perhaps that mindset was instilled into other people to an unhealthy point, right? That no one would challenge David because David never challenged Saul. And so when David comes up with this heinous act to basically leave a guy out and get him killed, to intentionally get someone killed, Joab doesn't challenge this, right? And we just read that Joab was like a pretty awesome guy. Joab and his brother Abishai like just beat up a whole bunch of Ammonites and Arameans, right? Now Joab kind of also looks like a kind of a wimp, right? Because he doesn't challenge this awful order of David. Because, David is essentially, like, it's like this. Think of it like this. Basically what's happening is that, imagine if you were at work and your boss told you that that he wanted you to fire your coworker who was also your friend. Actually, this is the premise. This actually happens in that live action Flintstone movie, right? Where Fred had to fire Barney because his boss told him to. But of course, the reason for that was because when Barney wanted to help Fred, he switched their exams so that Fred had Barney's answers, and so because Barney's really smart, and then Fred was like the biggest flunker because Fred's an idiot, right? So, and then of course this makes like a lot of turmoil between them, right? Because Fred has to fire his friend, even though Barney knows the truth that it should have been the other way around. But of course, when you have to fire your friend like that, it's a massive act of betrayal, right? Which, going back to Joab and David ordering him to kill Uriah, it makes you really think about these kind of things. And one of the problems, because once again we're just dealing with text, is that you don't really get to see this dynamic. It's assumed. This dynamic is assumed. But of course, I bring this up so that you can think this through and think about, the weight of what's happening here in the Bible. In that, yes, unfortunately, we are limited by text. And if you only read a text as like just words on a page, then yeah, like the Bible, like any other book, will be very dry. But if you think through stuff like this and what's happening in these scenes, that makes, well, not just the Bible, but any text a lot more alive. And I think it's an important exercise for us to do. So now you have to go from Joab's perspective, right? And now Joab, once again, on the one hand, he can't, well, the main reason why he carries out this order is that he can't challenge the king. No one can challenge him. Bathsheba doesn't resist him because she can't. He's the king. Joab does not challenge David on this outrageous order to kill someone that had been faithful to David for years, right? Because it's implied Uriah was one of the original 400 guys David had. So to someone who's been faithful all these years, Joab and Uriah were probably friends because they were part of this inner circle of David, right? As both of them were part of the original 400, they were part of this inner circle. So they were probably friends. And once again, it's one of those things that it's a shame that we don't get to see more because unfortunately the Bible doesn't give us more. But the thought process that Joab must have gone through to carry out this order, right? He can't disobey the king. But on the other hand, he has to betray his friend. But of course, the inverse of what the Bible does do is that, sure, it's fun to do this thought experiment to talk about Joab's feelings. And, I think it's a fun thing to do, and it's an important thing to do, because we want to empathize with these characters. But what the Bible also does is that it says this is all David's fault, right? He cannot blame anyone else. You can't chalk it up like, well, Joab carried out the order, so, he's a bad guy too. Bathsheba didn't resist David. She's, just as guilty. It's like, no, David is the Bible's painting him as that he's actually, David is a horrible person, right? Because he orders this. And then, of course, Joab has to betray his friend. And he does. He does, right? Now, of course, on the one hand, there's a special place in hell for people who commit betrayal. But on the other hand, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it's David who's really committing betrayal, because once again, Uriah was his friend too, right? And so, chapter 11 is really interesting because we really see the depravity of who he really is, and the depravity of that. And then, of course, to add insult to injury, after Uriah is killed, David then marries his wife. Like, he already pulled this move, like, at least once. And, that was already kind of scumbaggy as it is. But it's one of those things that's just like, it's the Bible reminding us that, like, this is how people behave, right? And if people were granted power like David does, it will be abused, right? And that's kind of fundamentally what the Bible is getting at here. And that's why, once again, even though you could kind of do these thought exercises of like why Bathsheba doesn't resist David, or Joab's thought process of like betraying his friend and all that, what the Bible focuses on is David's abuse of power, right? And when you put that in the central light of David is abusing power, it brings up the main theme of the book of Samuel. Only God can be king. Only God can be king. And one of the reasons is because, unlike Saul, unlike David, God, and by extension, in the person of Jesus Christ, does not abuse his power as king. And of course, I could go into a lot of passages in the New Testament, but I won't do that, just because then I would detract from what we're talking about here. And, well, I mean, to an extent I would be. I guess you could bring relevancy back to it, but that's also a mental exercise I'm not going to do. And it would be a lot of it, like jumping, through the Bible to find all these verses, but which I don't feel like doing right now. But basically, the point here in chapter 11 is that David is just like any other human leader, and he will abuse power if he has it. And the thing that, any person in the 21st century, we can obviously, like, yeah, abuse of power is a very real problem, right? And David is not, he is just part of the rule, right? Which then, since this rule exists, that human beings will abuse power, and it's where we get that old phrase, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It brings back the revelation that God gave to the prophet Samuel. Only God can be king, and if you reject God as king, bad things will happen, right? Even though David had moments where he was like this paragon of virtue, here he is, he's a man. And like any man with power, he will abuse it because power corrupts men. That's just the way it is, right? And so David, he's pretty awful because power corrupts him, just like it did Saul. And so, in a funny twist of events, he's not that different, right? And this is one of those things that I critique a lot of. I don't know if people in like Christians are disingenuous about this, or they just, or I think the safer assumption is that they just don't know the Bible very well. That's a safer assumption. But it's people are so quick to judge Saul on how bad of a king he is, but David isn't really that different. But it's not so much because of who they are as people. It's the fact that because we are people, and we have sin in our life, and that sin will twist everything. And if that sin, the sin in you it will twist anything. And if it can twist power, oh, you be damn sure it will twist that power. And that's exactly what has happened with David, right? Because David had shown signs. He had shown a lot of signs that, he's not someone that can be trusted with power. He's shown a lot of signs, right? He's a little too bloodthirsty. He's, can't keep his plunger in his pants, right? And then he's given power, right? And David abuses his power. And so chapter 11 does this interesting thing where it shows that, like, this is how power corrupts people. And how far, David is willing to abuse that power, right? He takes advantage of someone else's wife. And he makes friends betray each other, right? Like, those are some pretty awful things to do to people. And David does them. And then, of course, there's that little throwaway sentence at the very end of chapter 11. And what David did displeased the Lord. Which, you're probably thinking like, well, no duh, right? You think God would be pretty mad. Yeah, he's mad, right? God is super mad, right? Like, but with everything I just said, with like the comparison of David and Saul, the real question that comes up when the Bible gives this statement at the end of chapter 11 of the Lord is displeased with David, the question is, will God punish David the same way? And that's what we're going to read in chapter 12. Chapter 12. Oh, by the way, this will be the last chapter we read too. But don't worry, this one's going to be a doozy. The Lord sent Nathan to David. And when Nathan came to him, he said, crap, what was the voice I gave Nathan? There were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except for one ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who came to him. Now David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, as surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and had no pity. Then Nathan said to David, you are that man. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you, and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all of Israel and Judah. And if this had been too little, I would have given you more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. This is what the Lord says. Out of your own household, I am going to bring calamity onto you. Before your very eyes, I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all of Israel. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned before the Lord. Nathan replied, The Lord has taken away your sin from you, and you will not die. But because of doing this, you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, and the son born to you will die. After Nathan had gone home, the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife had borne to David, and he became ill. David pleaded with God for the child. He fasted and spent the nights lying in sackcloth on the ground. The elders of the household stood beside him to get him up from the ground, but he refused, and he would not eat any food with them. On the seventh day, the child died. David's attendants were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they thought, while the child was still living, he would not listen to us when we spoke to him. How can we now tell him that the child is dead? He may do something desperate. David noticed that his attendants were whispering among themselves, and he realized that the child was dead. Is the child dead? He said. Yes, they replied. He is dead. Then David got up from the ground, and after he had washed up, put on lotions, and changed his clothes, he went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. Then he went to his own house, and at his request they served him food, and he ate. And his attendants asked him, Why are you acting this way? While the child was alive, you fasted and you wept. But now that the child is dead, you get up and eat? And David answered, While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. And I thought, Who knows? Maybe the Lord will be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back to life again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me. Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba, and he went to her, and he made love to her. She gave birth to a son, and they named him Solomon. The Lord loved him, and because the Lord loved him, he sent word through Nathan, the prophet, to name him Jedediah, which means loved by the Lord. Meanwhile, Joab fought against Rabbah verse 26. Let's try this again. Verse 26. Meanwhile, Joab fought against Rabbah of the Ammonites and captured the royal citadel. Joab then sent messengers to David, saying, I have fought against Rabbah and taken its water supply. Now muster the rest of the troops and besiege the city and capture it. Otherwise I will take the city, and it will be named after me. So David mustered the entire army and went to Rabbah and attacked and captured it. David took the crown from their king's head, and it was placed on his own head. It weighed a talent of gold, and it was set with precious stones. David took a great quantity of plunder from the city, and brought out the people who were there, consigning them to labor with saws and with iron picks and axes, and he made them work at brick-making. David did this to all the Ammonite towns. Then he and his entire army returned to Jerusalem. So chapter 12 is a doozy. but it's a fun one. But Lordy, if I had to do that voice forever, it would die pretty quickly. So let's real talk here. Chapter 12, I love Chapter 12. Second Samuel. It's one of my favorites, actually. And that's really because I think Nathan is awesome. I love Nathan. The prophet Nathan is one of the coolest dudes in the Bible, hands down. Because he's the major contrast to chapter 11 that I was talking about, right? You know, when David was abusing his power as king and nobody challenged him, right? You know, Bathsheba doesn't say no, and Joab doesn't say no to basically David doing atrocities, if you think about it, right? But here's Nathan, who's just like, I don't give a crap who you are. You're just another man, right? Like, God says, and God, you know, God's will is God's will, and you challenge that, I will mess up your shit. And that's basically what Nathan does. And I love this guy. I love this guy because of that, right? Nathan doesn't take no crap, right? He just goes up to David and just calls him out. He's just like, you have done great evil. And the way Nathan does it is so sly, right? He gets David to burn up, you know, makes David feel self-righteous, right? And that's the interesting contrast, right? And this, once again, is how, once again, what makes Nathan awesome, right? You know, we read in chapter 11 that David, you know, he felt like he was, like, powerful, right? He could do whatever he wanted because he was the king of Israel, right? And so Nathan massages this ego a little bit. You know, he tells him the story about, like, a rich man who takes advantage of a poor man. And, you know, this gets David's fury, right? And David wants to be like displaying some righteous indignation. You know, Nathan, we should do justice, right? That's what David's thinking, right? Like, Nathan, if this guy, you know, this guy's crime, we're gonna do justice. And then Nathan just straight is like, that's you, right? And I've come here to bring you justice, right? Like, it takes balls, right? It takes balls to do what Nathan does, because, you know, David as the king of Israel could have been like, well, screw you, right? You die, Nathan, right? David very well could have done that, but of course, once again, you know, if David did that, then, you know, God could have intervened, and then things would have gone a lot worse for David, I guess. So, but, you know, hypothetically, David could have been like, screw you, Nathan, you're dead, right? For challenging the king, which is basically why Bathsheba doesn't reject David and his sexual advances, and why Joab doesn't disobey an order. Is because they're scared that David could just be like, you're dead, right? And here's Nathan. You know, David easily could have just done that. I mean, if you think about it, who is Nathan, right? Nathan is just some. He's like a cheap knockoff to Samuel, right? Like, one of the things that makes Nathan interesting too is that, like, okay, we look at the prophet Samuel, you know, the guy the book is named after. Now Samuel he's a big deal as a prophet. Sure, he's not Moses or Elijah, and they're said to be like the biggest prophets, right? Because one, they do the most miracles. Like, Samuel has like a couple miracles under his name, and they're only one of them is actually like pretty spectacular, right? Which is the thunderstorm that Samuel calls in chapter 6. He prays to the Lord, and then the Lord brings a thunderstorm, and it screws over like the Philistines. And then, like, they get stuck in mud and stuff, and then, like, the Israelites have an easy time defeating their enemies because they're stuck in mud, right? So that's like the one miracle Samuel really has under his name, right? Nathan has no such thing, right? Nathan has no such thing to his name, right? How many like, the other thing too that's fun about Nathan to talk about, and I've held off on doing this because I wanted to contrast of, like, okay, sure, Nathan may not be as cool as like all these other prophets, and by some people's definitions that I've listened to, like Bible programs and stuff, some people's definitions of a prophet, Nathan doesn't even qualify as a prophet, at least not in this point in time anyway. Nathan doesn't even qualify as a prophet, and yet he's still called the prophet. But he doesn't actually qualify as one, at least you know, more or less up to this point. He barely even counts as one. So to backtrack a bit to clarify something before some people say, well, the Bible calls him a prophet, therefore he's a prophet. Well, yeah, that's why I would agree with you on that sentiment. But of course, you know, when people talk about like, and some people even use the New Testament to back this up, even though it's not truly accurate. But I've heard some Bible like preachers and stuff talk about how like, okay, what makes a prophet and a false prophet? And so some people say like, well, false prophet. There are two things about a prophet of God that must be confirmed. One is that if they say something like God is going to do something, it's going to happen. And in contrast to this, um, here's a bad example, but we just got to deal with it because it's the way it is. Um, the false prophets on YouTube. That was a whole crazy controversy if you've ever read it up. Um, so basically, when it was during the 2020 election with Trump versus Biden, and there were people who were prophesying that Trump was going to win it, and it didn't happen, right? And so, by definition, those are false prophets because they said that God said something, but it didn't happen, right? So, one of the litmus tests of a prophet, quote unquote, is that if they say God is going to do something, it would actually happen because if they're speaking on God's behalf, then they would know what God's going to do. Therefore, anything they say would be tantamount to truth, right? That's the transition of logic. But a false prophet wouldn't know this, and so they could speak whatever they wanted. And then whether they were right or wrong, it's not relevant. It's that, well, more often than not, they'd be wrong, right? Because then they don't speak on God's behalf, whereas a real prophet does. But some people think that's not enough because some things that prophets have to also have miracles to back it up. That's how they show their authority from God. Now, this is obviously true with Moses, right? Moses fulfills both of these to a T, right? He says something God is going to do, God does it in style, right? When Moses says, you know, God will bring like destruction on Egypt, yeah, the plagues happen. Moses said, oh, the Lord will bring death upon the Egyptians, the firstborn were killed, and God did the whole Grid Reaper thing, right? And yes, anytime I have the chance, I will bring that up because it's fun too. So, you know, Moses is like the prime example of like this definition of a prophet, right? The prophet of prophets, if you will, right? He does the cool miracles, and what he says comes to pass because he speaks for God. Elijah is another such person that this tends to happen a lot. Elijah comes a little later from Samuel, from a chronological sense. But we'll use him as a reference, right? Elijah says there will be no rain for 3 years. And it happens, right? Elijah says to a woman, hey, why don't you feed me? Don't worry, God will provide for you. And he does, right? God gives the woman like a magic, urn that doesn't run out of oil, right? That kind of thing, right? And so Moses and Elijah, they fulfill that sense of prophet. But of course, what I'm going to talk about here is that prophecy is, what makes a prophet isn't those things, right? What makes a prophet is that by God's instruction, their job is to lead people how to live, right? This, by extension, I know my definition is kind of broad then, because you could say, well, most Christians can be prophets in that sense, which is true, which is actually what the New Testament is talking about when there are lots of prophets, right, in the New Testament. And that there are the church, the fivefold church has apostles, teachers, evangelists, prophets, and pastors, right? And so, by extension, any church will have a number of prophets, and prophets do exactly that. They go out and they help people, instruct them on how to live, right? See, this is where like you could easily poke at like, okay, I'm not a prophet by that extension. I don't necessarily give the more practical lessons of how to live. If you were to fit me in the fivefold of the church, you would probably throw me more like, yeah, teacher is kind of a easy thing I'd fit in because the streaming Parson is a teacher, really. So teacher would be an easy example. And of course, some people would say there's a pastoral element. I would fit as the pastor element, not just because I am a pastor, but because of like the pastor's role of caring for the church and okay, maybe I don't have as the streaming Parson, I'm a parishless Parson. That's kind of my description on YouTube. I'm parishless, which means I don't have my own church exactly. But, I do what I can to take care of people, and, like some of the Discord communities I'm in and whatever, I take care of people. It's kind of, I want to take care of people. And so that's kind of how you would say the pastor in me, right, comes out. And but I'm not so much as a prophet as a person to be like, to help you live for the future, right? And of course, I use that emphasis because that's where some people get the mixed idea of like prophets foresee the future, which is not always the case. And there are other prophets in the Bible who fit this, right? They don't see the future, but their teaching helps Israel prepare for what's to come. John the Baptist is the clearest example of this, right? John the Baptist barely ever tells people what's going to happen in the future. The only thing he talks about that's going to happen in the future is that the Messiah is nearby, right? And that he's going to do Messiah stuff, which then Jesus shows up, right? But for the most part, John the Baptist is a prophet because he tells people, okay, the Messiah is coming and he's very near. So get your lives in order, right? Repent of your sin, don't cheat people, blah, 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 right? And that's how John the Baptist is a prophet, a real prophet in that sense, right? That he tells the people how to really live for God, primarily, right? But, I mean, if I have to say for God every time in that regard, like, come on, you guys might need to go to an English class and understand nuance, right? So, you get the nuance, right? But anyway, so what does this got to do with Nathan the prophet? And I know I went on this crazy tangent about like the definition of a prophet. Nathan does not. He is an interesting case of what defines a prophet. Now, there's one explanation I was given as a kid, which I think is a good explanation. Of course, once again, it's kind of broad too, because of course, in our post-resurrection era, the definition of prophet is super broad. And the definition I remember being told as a kid, and it was actually a really good one, I stick to it, to this day. I'm like, yeah, that's the definition of prophet. That makes the most sense, right? It's the most biblically consistent. A prophet is a person who communicates with God on a very clear level, that God speaks to them in different ways, of course, right? And so, of course, the nuance as, post-resurrection era is that, since the Holy Spirit and Pentecost in the book, as shown in the book of Acts, well, since the Holy Spirit lives in all of us, then technically everybody can be a prophet because then the Holy Spirit speaks to all of us, right? So, by that definition, everybody's a prophet, right? But in the Old Testament, it was a lot more nuanced because that didn't happen, right? The Holy Spirit wasn't with, all believers in that way, like it was in the book of Acts and thus forward. So, when we use that definition that God directly speaks to these people, it stands out more in the Old Testament, right? Moses, obvious example. Elijah, right? But even those other prophets that don't have these cool things to their names, like Moses and Elijah, this is true for them. And Nathan is one such example. Now, goes back to chapter 12 and Nathan's badass moment where he stands up to David. Nathan knows something that he shouldn't know, right? This is probably his only miracle, if you want to call it that. Nathan's only real miracle, which now that, with that explanation given, Nathan doesn't sound anywhere as cool as Moses and Elijah, right? Which is why most Jews recognize like Moses and Elijah as like real prophets, right? Because they did all the cool stuff. Nathan's only cool thing to his name is that he's minorly telepathic. That's it. In only regard to this one thing, right? So the only thing that, where God directly speaks to him, we know that God speaks to him. That's how Nathan knows what he knows. And then so Nathan, that's the only miracle Nathan has under his belt. Is like, yeah, I just know stuff I shouldn't know. Unfortunately, it has to be bad stuff too, right? Like, so real great one there, right? But with that being said, despite how uncool compared to other prophets, how unaccomplished Nathan appears compared to other prophets in the Bible. Like, that doesn't matter to Nathan, right? Nathan knows that, like, I'm the prophet of God, and as God's servant, I technically have authority here, right? So I'm gonna say what needs to be said, and if don't matter, you're the king, right? And that's what Nathan does to David, and that's just like, if you put all that into consideration, that just makes Nathan look so badass, right? Because think of it this way, and this is the narrative. This is like comic book reference of the week, if you will, right? It's what makes like those less than superpowered characters so awesome. It's what makes people like Batman awesome and Captain America awesome, and why I had to give Nathan the Batman voice, right? Is what makes these kind of characters so awesome and why they're so popular. Is that even though they're not the most powerful, but far from it, right? They're not the powerful characters, but they will go head to head against like friggin' godlike beings at times to do what's right. And that's what makes them awesome. And that's kind of what Nathan does here. That's kind of, Nathan's kind of like a Batman here. I always made the joke that he's kind of like the Nightwing, the Dick Grayson to Samuel's Batman, right? Um, Nathan's kind of that, because he is Samuel's successor. But Nathan, he, even though he's the not so powerful guy, standing up to arguably the most powerful guy here, that doesn't matter. Nathan's gonna stand up for what's right, and that is, the will of God. To stand up for to correct sin, to challenge evil, right? And the evil in someone like David, and David's authority and power as king means nothing to him, right? Because Nathan is doing what's right. He's obeying the word of God. Now, an interesting parallel you're supposed to read with chapter 12 of 2 Samuel is actually chapter 15 of 1 Samuel, right? Where Samuel does the same to King Saul, right? He just challenges him and says, "No, you are not like, you can't go around saying you're in control, because didn't God give you your power? Aren't we supposed to remember that only God can be king?" And Samuel points that out with Saul. And now Nathan is pointing that out with David, right? And the interesting thing, the funny dynamic, and once again, this is what makes Nathan so awesome, right? Is that like when Samuel confronts Saul, it was easy for Samuel to point out, like, weren't you once a nobody, right? You were a nobody, and God gave you power, right? And so Samuel kind of does this humbling thing to remind him that, like, you, even like if you weren't king, you were a nobody, and I was always a somebody, right? As a prophet of God is basically what Samuel's getting. You were a nobody, and I was a somebody. So it's easy for me to stand up to you, and don't even think about challenging me. But here it's the opposite, right? Nathan never brings up that David comes from humble origin, because Nathan is aware. It's like, you may be the big guy here, and I'm the nobody, right? I mean, nobody. The Bible doesn't even record that I became Samuel's successor. Right? Like, I didn't even write that down myself. Right? Like, think about that, right? And now Nathan's here, like, but I'm going to challenge you anyway, right? Because you have disobeyed God, right? And what is the most important thing is obedience, right? Saul failed, and Samuel pointed that out. And now Nathan is pointing out with David. And it's a really cool parallel. You got to read 1 Samuel 15 again, and then read 2 Samuel 12. And it's this really cool parallel, how the prophets face kings, right? And to show that, like, doesn't matter who you are. What is the most important thing is obedience to God. It is something we all must do, right? Because remember, it doesn't matter who you are, right? Only God can be king, right? And that means that obedience to him is what matters. And so when Nathan is pointing this out to David, and of course the difference between David and Saul is that Saul just kind of pleads of like, oh, you know, like don't be so mean to me. Whereas David kind of is confronted and he's just like, yeah, I have done evil. Like, please acquit me, you know, like don't have God's wrath fall upon me, right? And so David kind of sees like, oh, you know, I really have done something terribly wrong, and you know, David acknowledges his sin, and you know, David has to later repent for it. And then Nathan's like, you know what? God will let you go, but there's still going to be hell to pay, and unfortunately, that means your son is going to die. And so, in a way, Nathan, you know, is just more badassery under his belt, because he's just like, yeah, you know, like there's gonna be some atrocities to like you, but it's gonna be way worse. But it's not gonna happen right away, right? Because for you to get punishment now would mean nothing. You're gonna get huge punishments down the road, and it's gonna suck, and you're gonna have to deal with it, right? And Nathan's just like, all right, I'm out of here. You have a great day. And then he just walks off. Like, David is speechless. He can't do anything, right? Because, you know, David may have been the most powerful guy in chapter 11, doing whatever he wanted. Chapter 12 ends with him. Well, this scene in chapter 12, the first half of chapter 12, ends with David basically like, he's put back to like that little punk that he was in like 1 Samuel 16. He was that kid again, a nobody, right? And Nathan didn't even have to point that out. Nathan just kind of said like, no, this is what God says. You're gonna deal with it, and just walks away, right? And Nathan kind of showing that like, you're, despite your power, you're really no one, right? And that's another reason why, you know, the weakness of humans, and why humans can't, like, let's put it this way, humans don't have power because we can't have power, right? And of course, any illusion of power, and the idea of, that's why people control other people, right? Is the illusion of power. But in the grand scheme of things, humans don't have power, not any real power, right? And David is reminded of that, and David is humbled by that as Nathan walks out of the room, which just makes Nathan look more awesome. I think this is why I really love this chapter, because this is really interesting dynamic, right? And Nathan shows that, like, you know, as the prophet of God, he has this power, right? And is a reminder that, like, yeah, you know, we're just people, and we're all accountable before God. And if you think you can get out of that, you're dead wrong, right? And that's an important thing to remember, right? We're all accountable before God, and don't think for a moment you can get out of it, right? Of course, you know, the popular illusion is just to say, well, God doesn't exist, so then I don't have to be accountable. That's what most people do as a self-defense mechanism. They just convince themselves that, well, I'm not accountable to God. So whether it's through like believing he doesn't exist, or making up a God that fits with their mindset, a, basically a God in their own image, so that, well, if there was a God, then if in my image, then he'd be cool with what I do, right? And that's what a lot of people tend to do, as opposed to like facing the reality that, like, we're accountable to a, you know, a holy and just God. So, and that is a terrifying thought, and it should be, right? I mean, he's God, so there's that, right? And of course, now you're accountable to him, right? Your actions matter, your thoughts matter, right? And that's what you know, Nathan was kind of tearing at with David, right? And to remind him his place, right? And that what's important is obedience. And that was something Saul forgot, and that's something apparently David had forgotten. Or let's just end this. Let's just speed run the rest of this. The rest of it is just kind of like a sequence of events. So basically, I guess we can now say Nathan has joined the official prophets group, as now Nathan, starting from this chapter, fulfills the other requirements, right? So something he said in the future will happen does happen. David has this unnamed son that dies, and he dies like basically a week after he's born. And it's interesting that the Bible points out that it's 7 days, because there's something interesting that would happen. So, bit of Jewish background. Part of Jewish religious rites, and some Jews still practice this to today. I mean, it depends on whether you're, an Orthodox or something. Yeah, you're true to like the traditions, if you will. That's basically what Orthodox means. Um, and the idea is that and we read this in like the book of Leviticus, for example, where one of the things that Hebrews did, that Jews did, if a boy was born, you would circumcise him on the 8th day. So a week and a day after he was born, he would be circumcised. And if he was your firstborn son, he would be dedicated before the Lord. And they do like this whole ritual thing about like, oh, the dedication to the Lord, whatever, right? And that would happen on day 8 after the kid was born. So the interesting thing in this story, I'm just pointing out some little tidbits here, with David's unnamed son dying on the 7th day, is kind of like the severity of like the kind of putting David through like, how do I put it? Like God is putting David through like a very serious punishment of how severe things are, right? And how severe his crime is, right? And this this is where like, okay, I'm gonna walk on some really thin ice here, because now it's one of those weird moments, and one of those things of like in the Bible, and this is one of those things that like some people don't like to read this part of the Bible because it does bring some troubling thoughts. But this is one of those other moments that makes God look really, really mean. But here I can kind like, unlike say like, when the last time I kind of mentioned that God being really mean was like what? When God decided to troll Saul in like 1 Samuel 30 with the necromancer, right? When God decided to troll Saul, like there's no real explanation for that. I can't give you one, right? But here I could give you an explanation of why God would do something that appears very, very mean. And so when by having the child die before the 8th day, and once again, the child is not even named, right? Because once again, part of Jewish tradition was that on the 8th day, when the boy was circumcised, more often than not, that's when he would receive his name. Like officially, right? Officially, the boy's name is whatever, right? On the 8th day when he's circumcised. And circumcision also served that purpose in the Jewish culture. So, by having the baby killed before then, basically God is kind of, the way to think of it is like, this kid I have no regard for this kid, right? Like, who is this, right? Doesn't even have a name, right? No identity. This son of David has no identity, right? As the 8th day, when the baby was circumcised and would be given his official name, he would have a identity. And so by God having the child die before that was kind of like a major slap in the face to David, being like, your kid is a no one, right? He has no identity, right? And he is dead before he is given one. Now, of course, people say, well, that makes God look terrible. He would disregard this baby like that. But at the same time, you have to remember that God is kind of showing David the kind of person he is, and saying that you did exactly this to someone, right? You did this to someone who did have a name. You treated them as if they were less than garbage, right? You did that with Uriah. Like, so for me to do this to it, like, you can't judge me for something that you yourself would do, right? And it's one of those things that, like, as modern people, it's something we have to be very careful of, especially when we want to make any statements about God, right? And this is one of those other things too about, like, it's really cringy where, like, people would make statements about, like, well, why does God do this or whatever, right? Oh, this makes God look terrible or whatever, right? Or, you know, God trolling people is mean. But it's like, it's easy to judge someone else. But then, of course, you know, the thing Jesus would criticize the Pharisees all the time is what we call hypocrisy. And the idea is that, like, well, you do these things yourself, right? And so, for example, like, when people say, well, why would God allow suffering? It's like, now, of course, the argument people like that make is that, well, because the difference is that God has absolute power, so he could just fix it all in an instant, which is true. But then, of course, the person of God is that, as a person, you know, he doesn't have certain obligations to do things, just like you and I do, right? So why does God allow suffering? Well, we too allow suffering in our own lives. When, let's say, now I'm not, no, see, this is one of those things where, like, once again, it's easy to point out because I too am guilty of this. Like, okay, there are people that are homeless. How come you or I don't just let homeless people into our homes and let them live here, right? Why don't I just let homeless people live here? And if I would, you know, then I could be immune to the judgment of why I let people suffer, right? Because I don't just invite homeless people to live in my house. I don't let people just have whatever they want, right? Then I can't say, like, oh, why does God allow suffering? Because that would be an unfair evaluation of his character. And it would also be unfair to judge another person. Of course, I'm talking about God as if he was just another person. But I'm trying to get this perspective kind of laid out for us, right? And it's something we must always be mindful of. Is that, like, okay, well, why does God allow suffering? Well, why do any of us allow suffering, right? But of course, the some people would throw the counter argument of, like, well, the difference between why I allow suffering and why God allows suffering is that, like, well, I can't help it. I I can't do everything, right? I can't just make a guy who's homeless have a house. I can't just have, you know, people who are hungry have food. I can't just do that. I don't have that power. But God does. And then people would then say, see, since God has that ability, he should just do it. But of course, once again, there's the more human elements we have to understand of, like, well, you as a person have enough power, right? And more often than not, the other thing too is that anyone who makes these judgment statements tend to have enough power, right? So, for example, like, okay, like, I live in this house that makes me pretty rich already. I have a $2,000 computer with, like, dual monitor. I have a nice lighting setting. I have a high tech microphone. And of course, you know, and I actually have received criticism of this. And then it makes you scratch your head, like, really? Do you live in your own world? But, like, when people say, well, here I am spending $2,000 on a computer. I could be using that to, like, feed homeless people instead of, like, having a $2,000 computer, right? Like, basically what I'm getting at is I have the power to change people's lives. Instead, I spend it on myself because I'm like any other person, right? And in that in of itself, you can't say that's a bad thing. Then all of us are, you know, irredeemable then by that logic, right? And that's a dangerous line of thinking you don't want to go down, right? But when we get to stuff like here with David and God's dynamic here, you know, God is showing David the kind of person he is, and God allows the same things to happen to David, right? That when David disregarded Uriah, then God says, well, I'm going to disregard your son. How does that feel? That's how it feels, right? And so, of course, when God does this, he's trying to teach David a lesson. And yeah, it's a pretty harsh lesson, right? It's a really harsh lesson, right? No one ever wishes to go through this lesson, but some people do. It's just the way it is, right? But basically, when God allows these things to happen and God does these things, he's saying like, well, that's how it feels, all right? That's how it feels. Like and when Nathan was chewing out David earlier, when he was like, well, you killed Uriah and stole his wife from him over his dead body, right? Like, do you not know the weight of how terrible what you did is? Well, God is going to show you how terrible that is. And so that's why God allows this son to die 7 days after he's born, because God is basically making a parallel between between David's unnamed son and Uriah, right? There's this parallel between them, and is that like you disregarded Uriah, so I don't have to show regard for your son, right? And that's the interest. That's why the story is so tragic the way it is, right? Because there's this whole scene where David's like fasting and he's praying for 7 days, right? He's fasting, he's weeping, he's in sackcloth, he's doing everything he can to bargain with God, and God disregards him, right? Because God is basically God's doing that's how it feels treatment, right? Oh, you come crying to me when like this thing is gonna happen. Well, imagine the people that cry to you, right? And here's a little fun thought experiment that once again I'm kind of interjecting here. But once again, I'm sure God was doing this to teach David how abusive he was with the power that David had. And so like, you know, oh, like you don't want me to do something? Like God's probably saying to David, like, you don't want me to do something? Well, what about Bathsheba saying no to you, right? And you essentially raped her. Essentially, because it's well assumed that she didn't do it with consent, right? So by extension, that's a form of rape. So because there was no real consent. I mean, she had to, but is that real consent? If she had to, if her life was literally on the line, because David could have her executed, right? So God's like saying, well, that's how that feels, huh? How's that feel, huh? How's it feel to ask someone for something, for mercy and being told no? How's that feel, huh? Or how about when you made what's his face, Joab? How did it feel to make him betray his friend, huh? How's that feel? Oh, I'm gonna betray you for a moment here, right? I'm not gonna listen to you. Why should I listen to you? You didn't listen to other people when they didn't want to do these awful things you made them do, right? And so God is really like basically saying like that's how it feels, right? Which I guess in a way this is true in all of our own lives, right? And it's one of those things that like God has to be fair in this regard, right? Because once again, the opposite. So let's put it this way, and this is where like a lot of theologians talk about how like the real problem when people ask the question of why does God allow bad things to happen to good people is actually a wrong question. It's a terrible question. It's actually completely inaccurate. The real question that should be asked is why does God allow good things to happen to bad people? Because there's a lot of evil that happens, and then God doesn't just do this all the time, which he should just do this all the time. Just be like, make other people suffer and say, that's how it feels, asshole, right? Because God's totally in his right to do that. But he doesn't, right? Instead, he decides to say, I'm going to provide a way for you to not pay for your sins. And I'm going to provide for you, my son who will take your sin upon himself so that you don't have to, right? And through faith in that son, in Jesus Christ, then you and I can have a relationship again. Instead of me just going, that's how it be. Oh, how does that feel, right? And so that's the other thing too. That once again, because we're reading the Old Testament, Jesus did not die for the sins of the world yet. So, God is just doing what He would do or what He should do to all of us, right? And that's the other thing too about this chapter that I want to get around when people say like, well, why would God allow this to happen? Why would God do this to David? It's because in actuality, this is what God should be doing with all of us. But instead, because of the person of Jesus Christ and His death and resurrection His death on the cross and resurrection, God doesn't just do he just doesn't do this as He should. He doesn't just make you suffer for your wrong actions and say, how does that feel? Because it's totally in His right to do so. And we read here in 2 Samuel that that's what He does to David, to teach him, right? And, sometimes people, in life, we do still have to face the consequences of our action, even when, we can pray and be forgiven of sin, but we still have to deal with the reality of your actions have consequences, which is what happens with David, right? Because David does say, I have sinned before the Lord. And Nathan says, well, God will forgive you of your sin. But there's still going to be there's still hell to pay, right? And that's the death of this unnamed child, right? And so I think this why this chapter is also a favorite of mine is that like it really brings that reality, to the forefront of like how God should behave, but He doesn't. And it's because good things happen to bad people. And why do good things happen to bad people? Because God is merciful and decides that I'm going to provide a way for humans to have a way out of their sin, and that is through the person of Jesus Christ. So, yeah, it's chapter 12 in a nutshell. I know chapter 12 is heavy, but it's a great one, and I definitely want you guys should definitely read like chapter 11 and 12 in that parallel, and read them together because it's so beautiful when you understand that like thank God, He doesn't do that with us really the same way anymore, right? Instead of just doing with David, like, oh, that's how it feels, asshole. Even though it's in God's right to, but instead provides us with a way out of sin through Jesus. And so I definitely, definitely read chapters 11 and 12 again. But that's going to be the end. That's it. That's all I have to say about that. I mean, I could talk more about chapter 12, honestly, because it's so much. It's so good. But I'm not going to. I'm kind of spent. And I think doing the Batman voice for Nathan kind of killed my throat. So I think we're finished here. Just some announcements and housekeeping. So the announcement is I will be well, I kind of already do this, but I want to do a more formal announcement because my buddy Baruka, the Chippy Toes, who I've had on this channel a couple of times when we play Dead by Daylight. My buddy Baruka, he's doing a 24-hour stream. I'm not going to be there for 24 hours, dude. I'm only going to be there for like less than half of it, honestly. Because one thing we have to sort out is that his stream will bleed into my his 24-hour stream will bleed into my next Bible reading stream. And so I wanted to make an announcement about that because he will be doing a 24-hour stream from, well, okay, it'll be 6 o'clock Central, so 4 o'clock Pacific time. 6 o'clock Central from 6 o'clock p.m. Central next Thursday, the 22nd. I think that's what that is, right? 22nd, yeah. Next Thursday, the 22nd, from 6 o'clock p.m. Pacific Central Time to 6 o'clock Pacific Time Friday, which means it will probably bleed into the reading stream. So there are two things we can do this. I might just stream anyway and overlap his, or I might talk to him, and I might do my Friday stream at nighttime, and then I will still hang out in his streams as I normally do. And I'm more or less a co-host on the stream since I'm basically always there. But since he has moved it from Wednesday to Thursday, his starting time, that means his stream will naturally bleed into the next reading stream, which is next Friday. From normally I do from 3 to 6, or 3 to 5:30 or whatever. Whenever I'm finished reading 4 chapters, right, and talking about them in great length. But basically, we'll see if I might just do a video upload version instead, and then still be on his stream, or I might actually stream at nighttime. I'm not 100% sure on this. I will definitely have confirmation for you by the time we do like our next Mario Rabbids stream on Monday. I'll probably have a confirmation for you by then. Because I mean, I only got the notice this morning that like he's changing his 24-hour stream. So we're gonna work around that, obviously, because I'm also part of that. So I'll let you know probably on Monday during Mario and Rabbids stream what we're gonna do for next Friday. With that said, the rest of housekeeping is pretty straightforward. Monday, Wednesday, Mario Rabbids 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock Pacific time. We're probably gonna finish the game by next Wednesday. Probably gonna finish it. So Mario Rabbids next Monday, next Wednesday. Of course, I will do like extra Mario Rabbids streams, or I might not even finish it next Wednesday and just like do all the backtrack stuff and get a bunch of items. Whatever. We'll see how that goes down, right? It is a blind playthrough after all, but I do feel like I'm getting close to the end of the game. Because I mean, I assume the game isn't even that long. Now that you think about it. But anyway, besides the point. Next Monday and Wednesday will be Mario Rabbids. Next Thursday we have Throwback Thursday episode as I continue Thicker with Blood. Blood is Thicker map of the Heroes 2 campaign I'm playing right now. So that will be next Thursday. And the next Friday, I'll let you guys know what's up with that and how exactly we're going to do our next reading video or stream, whatever it might be. Maybe basically our next Bible study on the channel. I'll let you guys know how exactly that's going to go down. So that's basically it for announcements and housekeeping. This is going to be the end of the stream. Hope you guys enjoyed reading through 2 Samuel with me and having a hoot over one of my favorite chapters, really. In the Bible, even, because Nathan is just awesome. But anyway, enough gushing there. But I hope you guys enjoyed reading 2 Samuel with me. I hope to see you guys for the streams next week and definitely for our next Bible read. Hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you guys have a great rest of your Friday, and I hope you guys have a great weekend. God bless you, and good night.